What's up, everyone? I'm Mnar Adley, founder and director of MintPress News and your host of the Mintcast. This is the official podcast of MintPress News. Now, we'd appreciate it if you interacted with this video to help us beat social media suppression. So, as you can see, it is election season again here in the United States, and that means that the world's eyes are drawn to our corrupt two-party duopoly, with a rapidly aging Biden decaying right in front of us. Donald Trump is now a heavy favorite to become commander-in-chief of the United States empire once more. Now, Trump has chosen JD Vance as his running mate, a character made and financed by Silicon Valley and surveillance state billionaire Peter Thiel. It seems no matter whom you vote for, our national security state and that of Israel's will be the winner. We have to remember that Peter Thiel's CIA tech empire Palantir helped Israel develop the AI lavender system, which has been used by the Israeli military to target civilian homes, children, and completely decimate the world's largest concentration camp with precision. However, this is not Peter Thiel's first ride in the Trump campaign, as he helped bankroll Trump himself in the 2016 election and even worked in his cabinet. Now, despite Trump campaigning as a populist, anti-establishment, draining the swamp, he is the swamp, and he's planning on overfilling that swamp with figures like Peter Thiel, who will take our technocratic surveillance state and war machine to the next level, far worse than what we saw during COVID. And who better to help us learn more about this than one of the most important journalists of our time, Whitney Webb. She's the contributing editor of Unlimited Hangout and author of the book One Nation Under Blackmail. Whitney is also a former MintPress investigative journalist. Whitney, it's great to have you on again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, first, I'd like to begin asking you about Peter Thiel himself. Trump's VP pick, JD Vance, presents himself, just like Trump, as a bit of a populist outsider. And you've noted in your reporting that his close connections with Silicon Valley billionaire Peter Thiel is poised to have unprecedented influence in a new Trump administration, and that this should deeply concern every American who cares about freedom, privacy, and reining in the surveillance state. So talk to me about that first, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So JD Vance really owes both his political career and his previous venture capital career to Peter Thiel. For example, Peter Thiel first met JD Vance when JD Vance was in law school, and subsequently offered him his first job in venture capital at a Thiel created venture capital firm called Mnar Capital. After that, Vance went on to become involved with AOL co-founder Steve Case and Revolution Ventures, and managed a fund there called Rise of the Rest, I believe, which was heavily funded by the Walton family behind Walmart, Jeff Bezos, and, a lot of prominent figures of the American oligarchy, and subsequently started his own venture capital firm, Mnar Capital, with heavy backing again from Peter Thiel and also from Eric Schmidt, who's a major actually donor to Biden and intimately involved in Biden's science and tech policy. And actually, the two of them are on the steering committee of the rather infamous Bilderberg Conference, interestingly enough. And in addition, when Vance decided to run for office or for Senate, he was heavily funded by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel donated $15 million to his campaign, which I believe at the time, and maybe still is, the largest donation, a single donation ever made to a Senate candidate. And then JD Vance ran initially sort of as a never Trumper and was very anti-Trump. And he became his vice presidential pick, arguably because that rocky relationship was soothed over by Peter Thiel personally, who took and accompanied JD Vance to Trump's Mar-a-Lago to sort of smooth over that relationship. And then Vance sort of became a big Trump proponent. And arguably there's a lot of people have referred to Vance as a Peter Thiel protege. And I think, given the evidence, that's pretty fair. But Peter Thiel has several proteges. Vance is one in politics now, and obviously prominent in the Republican Party, but other Noteworthy proteges include people like Sam Altman of OpenAI and WorldCoin, and also Palmer Luckey of the defense startup Anduril, and also of Oculus Rift, the virtual reality system that was sold to Facebook, which Peter Thiel, was on the board of from like 2005 until 2022, when he left to try and get Trump-aligned candidates elected. So Peter Thiel's important for a lot of reasons. I would I guess start off with Peter Thiel by noting that he co-founded PayPal. And so PayPal is sort of one of these ubiquitous, financial sort of like fintech websites, one of the pioneers of the field, rather. And, from its earliest days, people that were involved in setting up PayPal, which includes people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, it's been said, but the people who were making that company alongside them, that they were in discussions with intelligence agencies and federal agencies from the very beginning about what, those entities were, what they would support in a fintech company, essentially. And, as I reported back when I wrote for MintPress, the involvement of the now PayPal owner of the who created the Intercept and sort of privatized these Snowden leaks. And a lot of them ended up, never coming out. Allegedly, some of the ones that never came out documented in detail PayPal's relationship to intelligence that has supposedly been ongoing for some time. But aside from PayPal, the clear indicator of intelligence ties with Peter Thiel comes in the form of Palantir, which he incorporated in 2003, but which didn't really start as a company around 2004, 2005. Its first funder was the CIA's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel. The CIA was its only client until 2008. And between 2005 and 2009, the top engineers at Palantir say they made over 200 visits to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where the CIA directly guided and tweaked, their software products, which are now used by intelligence agencies around the world, as well as healthcare agencies. The HHS and CDC in the U.S. use Palantir, so does the U.K.'s NHS, and it's expanded really throughout the world. What is really arguably a CIA front company, as I've written in past reports on Palantir, the reason, or rather that what Alex Karp and Peter Thiel were interested in doing when they created Palantir was essentially privatizing the Total Information Awareness program that had just been defunded by Congress. Total information awareness is sort of an outgrowth of the Reagan-Bush era of domestic surveillance, schemes, some of which came up during the Iran-Contra proceedings and are linked to things like the continuity of government protocols and the main core database, which are efforts to sort of label people, label domestic dissidents as subversives, based on their online activity. And of course, in the 80s, it was based on other metrics, but now it's your online activity. So whatever data the NSA, for example, hoovers up about you, Palantir decides whether you're deemed subversive or not. And given the continuity of government protocols, which are still on the books, if the US government decides to invoke those, which can be under very vague circumstances, these people labeled subversives by Palantirs could have their constitutional rights suspended if those protocols are ever invoked. So Palantir's role in that, as far as the national security state goes, very nefarious, and they've been very involved in a lot of, other aspects of governance. It's gotten, increasingly bloated and large with over the years. It was intimately involved in Ukrainian military operations during the Ukraine-Russian conflict that's, of course, still ongoing, and are now playing an outsized role in Israel's war on Gaza, which is, as I'm sure MintPress viewers know, is using AI to mass murder entire families. And Palantir is openly a big part of that, and they're very proud of that. And even when Peter Thiel was asked about that quite recently, he said his bias was to defer to Israel as it relates to the use of AI, this AI-powered war machine that's, committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And there's a lot of other things to say about Palantir, too. I mean, this company really has a nefarious history. One of the things that a lot of people forget about them is that they created the first plan pitched to the federal government to destroy WikiLeaks and sort of what they called the WikiLeaks threat and stop, national security leak-based reporting. Talked about targeting people like Julian Assange and Glenn Greenwald specifically. So this is a company that doesn't value freedom of speech or freedom or your privacy or really, any constitutional right you have. And they directly enable, the warrantless spying on all Americans and use that to profile you on behalf of the national security state. And what's unfortunate, too, is that We know how Peter Thiel's influence during Trump's first campaign translated into Palantir getting what the New York Times called a bonanza of contracts with the military, the U.S. military, and also with, even more so with U.S. intelligence. And now we also have, the other PayPal co-founder, Elon Musk, now deepening his ties with intelligence agencies through SpaceX, and which was, of course, already technically an intelligence contractor because Space Force is both part of the military and also an intelligence agency. And so really what you're seeing here is this particular faction of oligarchs, sometime referred to as the so-called PayPal mafia, which have their tendrils deeply embedded in both parties. You may have Peter Thiel and Republican, but you'll have Reid Hoffman and Pierre Omidyar on the Democrat side, for example, and then Elon Musk also now on the Republican side. But really, these are people that build de facto monopolies in direct connection with the U.S. national security state. And if you look at Palantir, it's very clear they care very little about our constitutional rights and freedoms. And despite perhaps, the rhetoric they may espouse publicly. And, it's very unfortunate that so many people believe with how they frame themselves rhetorically, because it goes very against their actions. For example, Peter Thiel is often referred to by others as a libertarian, but this is someone who says that he doesn't like free market competition because competition can negatively impact profits, and openly promotes the idea of, quartering a market and building a monopoly. And when he's done that, which he has, he's done it in direct collaboration from the very beginning with the U.S. national security state. So I would not call that libertarian. I think it's quite clearly fascist.
So, in conclusion, it seems that JD Vance is basically a patsy for Thiel and will represent Palantir's CIA tech empire interests.
Well, I think it's quite clear if you look at, just American politicians in general over the last 100 years plus, they tend to serve their biggest donors. Correct. And are influenced by their donors. And that's why, follow the money has always been so important when you're reporting on political realities or political figures in the United States. And I think it's abundantly clear that JD Vance has those kind of very deep connections to Peter Thiel, and his political career and his venture capitalist career would not have existed if it were not for him. And it's also important to point out that after the vice presidential announcement, you have close allies of Peter Thiel, whether it's Elon Musk or David Sachs or Palmer Luckey or Palantir itself, a Palantir co-founder alongside Thiel named Joe Lonsdale, all beginning to dump millions of dollars per month in the same super PAC that's supporting the Trump-Vance ticket, only after that VP announcement was made. So clearly it seems like that particular network is quite convinced that Vance is going to be their guy when in office. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of these guys are very interested in dominating the digital financial system to come. For example, Elon Musk says that he plans to turn X, Twitter, into half of the financial system. And JD Vance has been on the Senate Banking Committee. He's involved in crypto regulation legislation that's being written and drafted. And going to be put before Congress. And it's very likely that he'll be involved in choosing the kingmakers of that, like, PayPal's very own recently launched stablecoin, and any of these others, companies and currencies that they're, intimately connected to.
So it sounds like what you're talking about is being pushed by a PayPal mafia, an Orwellian, programmable, and surveillance money system that you've written quite extensively about. And how will the Trump administration advance this financial tech monopoly system?
I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the move into central bank digital currencies, for example, or CBDCs. And there's been a lot of criticism around those because of the idea of it being programmable, surveillable money. But for money to be programmable and surveillable, it doesn't necessarily have to be issued by a central bank. It can be also issued by the private sector. And you can add that same type of Orwellian surveillance and the concerns about programmability, deciding what you can or can't buy based on various metrics, or, based on your online activity, or the claims of a coming social credit system and all of that. You can have that issued by the private sector, no problem. And so there's been efforts to sort of to make a digital dollar in the United States, and there's been concern that there would be a CBDC in the United States, and that's certainly been happening in other countries, but I think in the United States it's increasingly unlikely, especially considering that the Federal Reserve in the United States is essentially owned by the private Wall Street banks, and if you're a central bank digital currency, then the central bank is doing a lot of the job that Wall Street banks normally do, and Wall Street banks want to keep the two-tier system of private banking and central banking as it exists today. So they're most likely to be the issuers of that currency. And I think PayPal, in some of my recent reporting on my website, Unlimited Hangout, have focused a lot on how there's efforts by these groups that are either ex PayPal or who currently own PayPal to have PayPal and a lot of the companies that are intimately connected to it, for example, like Latin America's Mercado Libre, to be the rails on which all of these digital currencies will run, and to essentially dominate the field. And it's very likely that PayPal's PYUSD is going to be a major contender in that. A lot of other dollar stablecoins may be as well, like Tether, which was intimately tied up with the FTX scandal, or Circle, which has a very intimate relationship with Larry Fink's BlackRock. Any of these, but essentially which digital dollar coins are going to win. That's not going to be all be determined by regulation legislation that's being written. And has to be approved first, right, by the Senate Banking Committee on which JD Vance sits. And so, having these particular Silicon Valley figures all tied to PayPal influence him, I think in that context, is somewhat, significant, because regulation determines the winners and the losers in the market that it's regulating, right? And so, if the people writing the bill all have ties to the same companies that want to be winners, they can be favored, right at the legislative level, and have their work cut out for them essentially, and come to dominate the market. And PayPal has expressed for a long time they want to dominate the market. You have Peter Thiel on record saying that PayPal was created to replace the U.S. dollar. So there's a lot of things happening here, and what you'd have, as a consequence of that, would be the people that run PayPal, who in recent years have just been censoring people for things they've written and stuff like that. They're the ones that would be capable of programming and surveilling your money. And, that's very unfortunate, especially when you consider the connections of, someone like Pierre Omidyar, who owns PayPal right now, which I wrote about MintPress, several years ago. And I know that Max Blumenthal also did an investigative series for MintPress on our Pierre Omidyar. That's very important. I would encourage people to look at those to learn more about the people that are essentially running this company. And also, the other people that make up this particular network that is very connected to the so-called PayPal mafia, and really the PayPal co-founders. I mean, the intelligence ties abound, and I think it's a lot of them frame themselves as pro-constitution, pro-freedom, and all of this. But a lot of their business decisions reflect something else entirely, and I think it's important to warn people about this.
I mean, knowing all of this, how do we even begin to explain this mass rallying by working class white Americans that support Trump and his campaign, despite them caring so much about civil liberties, freedom, and their amendment rights, as they say, while ignoring Trump's ties to the very establishment they claim to be against?
I think some of it might have to do with, the other weekend's events, the attempted shooting, things like that really rile people up. And I think regardless of whether one thinks an event like that is inorganic or organic, it doesn't really matter. The powers that be at the end of the day, when the American public, or really the public of any nation, is very emotional and very riled up, they're more easy to manipulate. And you better believe that they make efforts to sort of use that emotional energy to nudge people in a particular direction. And so I think, that's something people should consider there. And I think obviously, that's going to, it seems like it's had the effect of sort of rallying people around Trump and making them, his supporters, much more enthusiastic than they perhaps were before about his candidacy. And I also think a major factor, too, that we can't ignore is the fact that Peter Thiel is a major funder of independent and alternative media. Not MintPress, not me, and definitely there's plenty of other journalists who are not funded by Peter Thiel, but a lot of the biggest names are. And, for example, when Tucker Carlson went independent from Fox, he entered into talks relatively shortly thereafter with Peter Thiel, who was going to finance him. I'm not sure if that's confirmed or not, but it's definitely worth considering, especially since Tucker Carlson was one of the major people lobbying Trump to select JD Vance as his vice presidential candidate. And of course, Peter Thiel is a major investor in Rumble, which is an alternative to YouTube that tends to appeal mainly to right-leaning audiences, and a lot of the figures on there, the biggest names anyway, many of them are all in on this particular ticket, and receive some sort of financial compensation, from Thiel-funded Rumble to post their videos there. Obviously, that's not true for everyone that's in the contractual situation. For example, Jimmy Dore recently had me on to talk about how awful Peter Thiel is for over an hour. But there certainly are people that I think aren't inclined to criticize him. I mean, he is a very powerful figure, and a lot of people in media, unfortunately, are funded by him. And there's been sort of this increased, effort to sort of, well, we've seen it for a long time, like with The Intercept, for example, and Pierre Omidyar are sort of launching this sort of what was framed then as this dissident outlet. These billionaires sort of coming out and framing themselves as the saviors of journalism. We've seen that more recently with Elon Musk and, the Twitter files, and his efforts, his claims of buying Twitter to turn it into a free speech platform, though I would argue that his motives are something else entirely. And he's essentially said that they're, the main factors were something else. So he wants to bring back his original X.com, which is what he brought to PayPal back in the late 90s when he and Peter Thiel teamed up. He said he wants it to be half of the financial system. He wants to turn essentially what was Twitter into a bank. And his other ambition, I would argue, is to hoover up all the user data to train his AI. He has an AI company that produces the Grok chatbot, which is now integrated into Twitter, and of course is a competitor, to OpenAI's ChatGPT and all of that. But it can, have unique access to all of that user data. I would argue it's for, algorithmic training. And other things as well. And then another one of his ambitions, as he said, is to verify all humans on the platform, which means linking your government issued ID to your social media account, which is a part of this broader effort that includes PayPal, and also the FBI and the Secret Service and Israeli intelligence, to end online anonymity, specifically on social media networks, and prevent people from using an anonymous account, or really having any sort of privacy online, period. And that's essentially what would happen. And in the first people they've been piloting the verification of government issued IDs ever since Elon Musk took over. And the first company he had was called Authentics, which is, I believe, created by former members of Israel's Shin Bet security agency. And he recently switched because of backlash over that to Stripe, which Peter Thiel is a major investor of. So keeping it all in the family.
Well, I want to talk more about Peter Thiel, who is funding independent media, as you mentioned, and Rumble. And it seems like he's possibly influencing, we don't know for sure, people like Russell Brand and Tucker Carlson to draw people on the libertarian side back to supporting Trump. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I don't really want to pick fights with anyone necessarily, but I sort of do disagree with a lot of that rhetoric. And I think it's very hard to frame yourself as a libertarian, someone who's against, big government, right? And then see a hero in someone like Peter Thiel, who claims to be a libertarian, but, as I mentioned earlier, his actions are quite different. He's not into free market competition, and he has given the national security state the worst parts of the federal government, the most powerful tools that they're using to directly undermine our constitutional rights, our freedoms, and our privacy. And so I think, generally libertarians are anti-war, anti-surveillance state, and all of these things. And it's very hard to reconcile those positions with support of someone like Peter Thiel, or someone who's so intimately connected to him, and frame them as a populist hero, when really they're tied to someone who, if anything, is an enabler of faux populism that really, at the end of the day, isn't pushing populism or promoting so much the public as rising up and saving itself or saving the country, but more so, let's look to all of, this squad of billionaires that will save and rescue us. And there's been a lot of talk sort of like that in these particular networks of Elon Musk is saving the country and saving free speech and all of this. For example, one of the Twitter files, reporters, Michael Schellenberger recently tweeted, Elon Musk is the only thing standing between us and complete tyranny. This is a person who's a Pentagon contractor, an intelligence contractor, building spy satellites for the CIA. He's intimately tied up with Netanyahu recently, or was one of the attendees at Netanyahu's recent speech before Congress, and has been, very vocal about his support of Israel and what it's been doing in the Palestinian territories and in Gaza, which is just mind-boggling. But he's also making a brain machine interface, a brain chip for people. I mean, it's current. I mean, it's just, for me, it doesn't make a lot of sense that people want to look to these billionaire businessmen as our saviors just because we're told particular narratives about them, or that there's been efforts by Hollywood to frame them as, Tony Stark in real life and all of this. I think that's sort of just the effort to manufacture heroes. But I don't think these billionaires are going to save us. You don't become a billionaire in the United States with close ties to the national security state without doing horrible things and playing ball with the worst elements of our government and our corporate, in the corporate sector. And I, think that unfortunately it has to be a combination of financial incentive as well as perhaps naivety in some cases. But I think the financial incentive cannot really be ignored. Elon Musk, and I'm sure as part of his efforts to turn X into a bank, has become a key source of monetizing for a lot of journalists and influencers and content creators on Twitter. Some of them have posted that they make thousands of dollars a month just by posting content on Twitter. And, some of them simp for Elon because of that. Or, maybe there are other financial incentives involved. I don't really know because I don't participate in that program. But, there's a lot of different ways to sort of get people to self-censor. Some of it can be by funding them directly, or some of it can be, in the case of Musk, that you control a platform that people are using to make money or distribute content. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to try and not be so dependent on these billionaire-run platforms and oligarch-run platforms as the only means of distributing information and having our voices heard, because censorship continues on Elon Musk's X. It certainly didn't stop just because he bought it, and his close ties to Israel, which has been very interested in censoring a litany of critics for quite some time, and puts in, millions upon millions of dollars annually in doing so. I think it's definitely needs to be looked at a little more critically. And as far as the promotion of Trump goes, what really disappoints me about a lot of the coverage from independent media is that people just seem to have complete amnesia about his first term. This is someone who's already been in office, who already had a campaign that was, promising, I guess, the right-leaning populist version of hope and change. And of course, that didn't materialize in his first term. And now we're being told that it's all going to be different now. It just reminds me so much of what happened with the left and Obama when there was all this energy behind him, and then he was going to bring the stop the criminality of Wall Street banks during the 2008 financial crisis. And then Citigroup was later found to have picked his cabinet essentially in his first term, and, was obviously a complete sellout. And then, but when he was running for his second term, there were all these reasons people gave, right? Like, oh, it was, the people he was surrounded by. Oh, it was, the Republicans in the legislature and this and that. And, just all these excuses. And then it's this, his second term was arguably worse than his first term. And I mean, I think we're just in trouble if we keep saying, oh, we need to keep voting for the lesser of two evils. I mean, it's just insane to keep doing that, considering the state of the country, and think things are going to magically get better just by voting for one of the lesser of two evils. I mean, it honestly doesn't really make very much sense. And again, there's been this complete amnesia about what Trump did during his first term. And a lot of it is not positive for, populism, really. He made John Bolton a neocon, his national security advisor. His biggest donor was Sheldon Adelson, who had pushed to preemptively nuke Iran. I mean, he didn't do that. Trump didn't do that when he was in office, but he is very proud of his role in assassinating Qasem Soleimani, which very nearly did instigate a war with Iran. And then you had Mike Pompeo, a CIA director, have Assange arrested. He was only recently freed, and it wasn't Trump that freed him. I mean, just not good. You had the COVID response, which was heavily militarized, Operation Warp Speed. A lot of corruption there that I reported on at the time. Palantir got all of our COVID data, arguably because Peter Thiel was one of the main donors to Trump's first campaign and was intimately involved in Trump's transition team, particularly as it related to the Pentagon, and just resulting in all these contracts for them. There was a lot of other, instances where a lot of his cabinet appointments were lobbyists for the very industries they were supposed to be regulating. This is not populism. There's even been talks. Trump told Bloomberg a few months ago that he was, or a few weeks ago, sorry, that he was considering Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, to be Treasury Secretary. He's denied it now, probably because of backlash. But Trump is very cozy with a lot of these bankers. He's very cozy with Larry Fink of BlackRock, for example, which is who he put in charge of essentially of U.S. COVID fiscal response. The money printing that went on during COVID, and it was handed out directly to BlackRock to distribute by the Federal Reserve. And I mean, Trump helped make that happen. Larry Fink used to manage his personal wealth. People don't really look at these connections. Trump pardoned Michael Milken, the junk bond felon from Drexel Burnham Lambert, intimately involved in the CIA and organized crime like savings and loans crisis of the 1980s, but he couldn't bring himself to pardon Julian Assange, right? So, there's plenty of other examples I could give. For example, after the El Paso Walmart shooting, Trump called on big tech to develop software to surveil social media users to determine if someone might commit a shooting before they'd commit a shooting, essentially pushing big tech to create pre-crime software, analyzing people's posts. He very nearly created a program called Safe Homes that was going to use consumer electronic devices like Fitbits, Apple Watches, Amazon Echoes, and also, American social media accounts to profile Americans and determine if they were showing any signs of what they determined to be neuropsychiatric violence, and that to see if you might commit a crime in the future, and then either, order you to attend sessions with a court-ordered physician, house arrest, potentially preventative detention, which essentially means going to prison for an X amount of time without trial, right? So, these are things that were being considered then that are just completely insane if you look at it. And I think that all this energy around Trump is really unfounded. It seems to be mainly founded on these different court cases and different things that have targeted Trump. And, I think, again, a lot of it comes down to sort of manipulation of narratives, which unfortunately has happened a lot in alternative media, about the nature of the deep state that Trump is supposedly fighting. I mean, there's plenty of people who think the deep state is a purely Democrat Party affiliated thing. And no, it's very deeply tied to both parties. I mean, the Republican Party is the party of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. I mean, you look at what happened during those administrations, it was completely insane, just like what happened during the Clinton and Obama administrations has been completely insane. And now the Biden administration, we have to keep in mind that this is a uniparty. And I think there's been efforts to sort of, just because Biden's been so terrible and is so obviously, non-functional, to sort of, sort of manufacture all of this energy for Trump. And I just don't find it convincing when you look at, the policies he's had. But again, so many people, especially in electoral campaigns, focus on rhetoric. They don't focus on policy records. They focus on what people are saying. But even then, I mean, you have Trump on the campaign trail this time around talking about how the United States needs a biometric entry and exit system, have everyone like scan your face or scan your eyeball to to enter and exit the United States. And this is something that one of these Peter Thiel connected companies, Palmer Luckey's Anduril, is creating. They're creating this virtual border wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Trump, when he was in office the first time, abandoned completely the idea of the physical barrier on the U.S.-Mexico border he campaigned on, and instead backed what had been until then the Democrat idea of creating this virtual smart wall, which now a Peter Thiel funded company is creating. And it uses, it can use facial recognition and all of this, detect people from 3 kilometers away. And even though it's been live on various parts of the border, it hasn't resolved the migration issue, but it's being used to manufacture consent for this biometric, ID system, essentially, that's being pushed around the world globally by these public-private partnerships of, very corrupted public sector institutions, and then these big tech billionaires, people like, Facebook. So that's Mark Zuckerberg and also Peter Thiel. It was a big part of ID 2020, which was co-founded by Bill Gates, and all of these, there's a lot of Silicon Valley billionaire involvement in pushing for digital IDs. The Omidyar network is intimately involved in that. Pierre Omidyar's one of his philanthropic vehicles. A lot of these billionaires are pushing for these things. And now you have Trump, directly promoting it on the campaign trail. And a lot of his base, during the COVID era, were very critical of the digital ID agenda. And, what I would argue actually rightly saw that vaccine passports, as they were being piloted, particularly those that are, QR codes and on a smartphone, were sort of just a trial run for this broader, digital ID effort that is meant to supercharge, the surveillance state, the very kind that, companies like Palantir have been helping to build.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, but, let's just go into Israel, Elon Musk, and the FBI's efforts to end that online anonymity that you talk about. I have more questions to ask, but what you just described leads me to ask how this will affect not only censorship, but how people can access their own money if they challenge establishment narratives. And could this expand the gap between the rich and the poor?
Yeah, so there's been a major push for several years to sort of eliminate online anonymity. And by that, I mean, what the agenda more expressly is to have you link your internet activity, all of it, through the internet service provider or ISP to a government issued ID. So in other words, in order to use the internet, you would have to provide a government issued identification in order to be granted access to the internet. And then everything you do online, every site you visit, as well as everything you would post, would be directly tied to your government issued identification or your identity. And this is being framed as the only way to stop cybercrime, to stop cyberbullying, to stop any number of problems, we're told. But ultimately what it really does is that it supercharges the surveillance state that has already been hoovering up essentially everything about our online activity. But the difference is that there has been the infrastructure set up for the past 20 years for the so-called war on domestic terror. And that is very far, they don't really have that much more infrastructure to set up. And so I think, once you have this large apparatus ready to go, I think it's very likely that the reason they would want the government IDs tied to your online activity is that, if it's an anonymous account, they would have to admit that they've used illegal means of spying on you or of obtaining that information, and they couldn't use it in court. But if they wanted to prosecute someone for online speech or for online activity, which, under these groups, they define that is one of the definitions of cybercrime is alleged spreading of misinformation and disinformation online. You can be considered a cyber criminal for that. They're framing this as a way to go after criminals. And so if you're accused of spreading misinformation and disinformation, if you tie that to your government issued ID, then they can use that evidence against you in court. So if you have an anonymous profile, they might have to use sort of unconventional means that aren't technically legal. Because we know that they warrantlessly spy on all Americans and hoover up everything anyway, but they can't use it, legally. And there's been efforts to, as I mentioned earlier, not just do this war on domestic terror, but also, use this pre-crime paradigm. And that was something that was actually legalized under the Trump administration by then Attorney General William Barr, which again was a report I did for MintPress on the time. And I think it was really the only report, about that program that was made at the DOJ by Barr at the time. And unfortunately, that policy is still on the books at the Department of Justice. And so you don't even have to commit the crime. You can just post something on Facebook or post something online and be arrested for it. And I think, unfortunately, as time goes on, it's very possible that may advance considerably. And it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the law enforcement agencies that would be prosecuting these, like the FBI, for example, have very deep ties to groups like the Anti-Defamation League, for example, which is intimately involved in training them on what qualifies as hate crime and hate speech. And the ADL has essentially been funded by oligarchs linked to organized crime for a very long time. These include people like the Bronfman family, and the Wexners and other people of the so-called mega group, which was originally created by Wexner and Bronfman, but include other prominent families that also have organized crime backgrounds, like the Crown family of Chicago, for example. And, there's other well, Steven Spielberg's also a member, but he has some interesting ties to organized crime figures like Lou Wasserman, for example, his alleged mentor. One of the main groups that I've written about as it relates to trying to end online anonymity is this group that's housed within the World Economic Forum, which again has sort of became rather infamous during the COVID era, but its main goal is to promote public-private partnerships worldwide. Yeah. And so that's essentially what this is. It's called the Partnership Against Cybercrime, housed within the World Economic Forum. The Partnership Against Cybercrime is run by a career Israeli intelligence operative named Tal Goldstein, that was actually the architect of I guess one of Netanyahu's terms, his cyber policy, which included certain policies, like I wrote about for MintPress, where projects that were previously done in-house by Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies were now being done through front companies in Israel's cybersecurity industry. So that's Tal Goldstein's claim to fame, and now he's running this Partnership Against Cybercrime within the World Economic Forum, and that is pushing for this into online anonymity and this effort to criminalize online speech as cybercrime, among other things. And there's also an effort within there to criminalize crypto and any sort of financial transaction that they also can't surveil. So again, I would argue it's tied to this other agenda of imposing programmable, surveillable money on people. And so essentially what you have, the actors you have as part of this partnership, you have PayPal, you have a lot of big Silicon Valley companies like Microsoft, I believe, is a member. Other big banks, Bank of America, for example, is a member. And then intelligence agencies, mainly UK intelligence, Israeli intelligence. And then you have, the DOJ, FBI, and Secret Service as members from the United States. And they work with other sort of alliances that are also pushing towards the same goal. One of these is called the Global Cyber Alliance, which was a project created by Cyrus Vance Jr., who used to be one of the, I forget exactly his title, but he was involved sort of in judicial, like one of a big prosecutor in New York, but he didn't target prominent people, but I forget exactly who. I think it might have actually been Epstein at one point, but I'd have to go back and check my research on that. Sorry. But anyway, he's kind of been, was criticized in that role for being somewhat corrupt. And he teamed up with one of the main, police officials in the city of London in the UK. And then I guess another figure that was, I believe, tied with the Center for Internet Security. I don't know. I wrote about this like 4 years ago. So sorry if I'm a little, don't have all the details at my fingertips. But essentially, it's a network of companies on that particular Global Cyber Alliance. PayPal's there again. You have Facebook. I believe you have the Omidyar network as well. And, several governments, the government of France, the government of Saudi Arabia, a lot of different governments are involved there, along with, again, a collection of big banks and a collection of big tech companies, all sort of coming together to say we need to sort of link people's ID to their internet activity for a safer internet. And again, this is part of the agenda that we see with Elon Musk and Twitter, of the goal of verifying all humans and slowly but surely pushing people to link their government issued ID to their account. And he's claimed multiple times since that this is the only way to deal with Twitter's massive bot problem. But I would argue that a lot of Twitter's massive bot problem is because governments around the world have invested millions and millions of dollars in bot armies that have become increasingly more sophisticated, particularly the United States military. And again, Elon Musk has a business relationship with the US military. So I think it's very unlikely that he would rein in, the bots created by the US military, which again is a matter of record. Israel also has a significant one, as does the UK, and essentially every country, I'm sure at this point, has a significant arsenal of that. So again, I think it's not really about bots. I think again, it's about linking government issued ID to what you do in that regard. And if he has all these connections with either the Pentagon and now with intelligence agencies, it seems likely that they would benefit from that user data, which again, data has become one of the most important commodities in the world. That's why people have been saying data is the new oil. So essentially all user data generated by this stuff is very lucrative for the people that own these platforms. And we know it's a matter of record that intelligence agencies spend a lot of money buying that data, even in the cases where they're not given it freely, like they do pay for it also. So, there's a financial incentive to use user data that way as well. And I believe there was a recent X policy announcement that DMs, direct messages on the platform, governments could be granted access if requests were made to your DMs. So after he previously claimed he was going to encrypt DMs, right? So something that seems to happen a lot on Twitter these days is that Elon Musk will play sort of good cop, bad cop with Twitter leadership. So either the CEO, Linda Yaccarino, or some affiliated account will announce a controversial X policy, and then Elon Musk will come in to say, oh, well, we're going to do this instead, or we'll redirect or something. But ultimately, the policy still stands. But people think Elon Musk has challenged it in some way, even though he hasn't meaningfully done so. And this is how, things have been progressing. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, he's also trying to make Twitter into a bank. Again, a way to sort of link this new effort, this effort to have your ID tied to your media, and it's going to be a biometric digital ID at some point, and then have this all linked to your finances, your financial wallet. And this is really the cornerstone of one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals within SDG 16. The implementing partner of that is Interpol, which the ambitions of it are to be a global police force. And they created their global policing goals, which is having every Interpol country implement some sort of form of biometric digital ID. And you're seeing it roll out across the entire world, essentially in lockstep. It'll be rolled out in essentially every country in the world within the next 2 years. And in that documentation, it talks about explicitly the need to link that to your finances, to some sort of digital wallet, which a lot of these, different people that I mentioned earlier in this so-called PayPal mafia space, a lot of them are trying to dominate that digital wallet space specifically. But of course, there's other players that are trying to dominate it as well. And I think that's, part of the ambition of Elon Musk and X is to have it be a powerful player in that regard. And that's why I would argue he's pushing for the ID functionality as well as to have it be a bank. And I think now they have a money transmitter licenses in a majority of US states now. And I'm pretty sure soon they'll have licenses in all of them, and then actually will begin functioning as a bank. But again, your banking activity will then be tied to what you tweet. Let's say that you're, a person, an influencer, perhaps on X, and you build up an audience and you start monetizing there and you become dependent on that monetization. But let's say you tweet something that gets you banned from X, from Twitter, especially when it begins to function as a bank and you're using it as your bank. You're not only deplatformed from social media, you're deplatformed from your income, your revenue, and also from your bank, right? I mean, having all of these things together is, in my opinion, not a good idea, especially considering that social media platforms do ban people, and it's unlikely that they would stop, even if they begin functioning as a bank. And we've had examples of recent years of people, banks like JP Morgan, for example, debanking people just because of articles the CEO was writing and all of this stuff. I mean, it's completely insane. And again, this underscores the danger of having programmable, surveillable money, period. CBDCs are not the only threat in that regard. We have to look out for the Wall Street issued ones and the ones issued by PayPal and these other things as well, because in the US, it's likely to be, the digital dollar that will be in our digital wallets tied to our biometric digital ID is likely to be one of these at the end of the day. And the idea of having it tied to your social media posts and your ideas is not good, and is essentially the very like social credit system that people on mainly right-leaning people have been so concerned about in recent years. I mean, this is essentially what X is setting itself up to be, not as a bastion of free speech, maybe for now to get you dependent on it or to get you to post things you otherwise wanted that will come back to haunt you later. But Elon Musk has made his affiliations very, very clear, whether it's with the U.S. national security state or Israel's. And I think, for people that are critics of both of those, definitely don't get dependent on these platforms as your way to distribute content and connect with people, because it's only a matter of time until the critics of such are censored, particularly when they come to dominate. I mean, imagine if Twitter really does fulfill Elon Musk's ambitions and become half of the financial system. It would wield enormous power, not just in terms of information distribution, but people would be dependent on it for their finances. And again, that can be very problematic when you have someone running it with all of these national security state connections.
Incredible. As Israel commits mass genocide in Gaza, as you just talked about, I want to learn more from you about Israel's Mossad and Unit 8200, and Israeli intelligence in general, and their influence on Silicon Valley and their role in working with Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and even within the Trump administration, to help create this Orwellian surveillance nightmare that you've written about right here in the United States.
Yes, so there have been efforts for a long time to link, America's Silicon Valley, sort of with Israel's equivalent of that, which is intimately connected to its cyber intelligence unit, Unit 8200. And one of the main facilitators of this was this group that was made by Paul Singer, who's a longtime neocon donor, but he's also been called a vulture capitalist for what he's done, for example, with Argentina's distressed assets during the various economic crises it's had. And I believe he is a hedge fund manager. But this particular group he created was basically the way it framed itself was in order to prevent for the growth of the boycott, divest, or and sanctions group, the BDS movement, we need to sort of have the United States and Israel economically yoked, so that the United States can never effectively adopt BDS as a policy in any meaningful way. And so a lot of that was to try and get U.S. companies to acquire these Israeli startups, many of which are directly tied to their intelligence services. And that has happened in Silicon Valley in significant ways. I know when I worked for MintPress, and I know Alan McLeod has done this as well, gone over all of the different, top people at big tech companies and their ties to, Israeli intelligence, for example. And a lot of them will be ex-Unit 8200 in very prominent positions. And a lot of this is because these big tech companies gobble up Israeli startups and then put the people that founded them, which are Israeli intelligence veterans, a lot of the time into prominent positions in the company, or sometimes they'll just hire independently. But, there's a lot of intimate connections, and it's not really just at that level. It's happening on a lot of other levels as well. And I think, part of that, one example of that, I guess, you could point to is the fact that nearly every big tech oligarch in the United States had some sort of relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, whether it's Bill Gates or Reid Hoffman, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, all had some sort of significant, I would argue, relationship with Epstein. That's why so many of them, including Musk and Page and Brin, were subpoenaed as part of the Epstein JP Morgan case in the USVI until JP Morgan paid millions of dollars to make that very inconvenient lawsuit go away. But why were all these big tech oligarchs served by someone that we know now was working with Israeli intelligence to blackmail prominent figures in the United States? And why were these figures so deeply connected to him, and why are they all so favorable to Israel's policies and favor censor on behalf of Israel, or directly enable their activities? I mean, there's plenty of these U.S. big tech companies that are major contractors for either the Israeli government or the IDF directly. And, I've argued in past reporting that at this point, it's a binational security state, that the U.S. and Israeli national security states are very intimately fused. For example, you had even companies like Lockheed Martin, a well-known company of the military industrial complex, have extremely deep ties with Israel's national security state, and have offices in these places where Unit 8200 companies are incubated, and all of that. And I've even written about, cyber reason, for example, which is one of these companies that actually the CEO essentially admitted it's a continuation of his work at Unit 8200, became intimately involved with Lockheed Martin, and are now running on a bunch of critical infrastructure that is essential to the functioning of the U.S. military, even though they say that, they essentially say their work is a continuation of their time at a foreign intelligence agency. I mean, it's really shocking, and obviously there's so many other examples of that that I could give, and the fact that there's been nothing done about it tells you that it obviously doesn't concern our politicians. And why is that? Numerous reasons, I suppose, we could look into as to say why that is. But the fact that it is, and that it isn't being questioned, even though it would normally be framed as a threat to U.S. sovereignty and national security, I think is really telling of the fact that arguably these two countries have fused their national security apparati. And I would argue a big part of that is because a lot of the interest groups that helped create modern U.S. intelligence were also very involved with creating Israel's national security apparatus when Israel was founded in 1948 and in the years immediately after that. And that's why you have, through a lot of controversial CI operations, they seem to be done jointly with Israel. Iran-Contra is a great example, but there are many others, like the Prama software scandal. And, unfortunately, I think as far as it goes with Silicon Valley, they tend to, have biased opinions about the Israel-Palestine issue. And I think we can see that, for example, with the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, being basically saying that people should not protest the Gaza war, and that their side, the pro-Israel side, has to win, the intellectual war, or, the U.S. can never deploy troops anywhere again, as it relates to Israel's genocide in Gaza and all of this stuff. And these are the people that are profiling who goes on the subversive list for the CIA. It's very concerning stuff, and they're directly aiding and abetting, foreign war efforts, taking sides in foreign conflicts, and then telling Americans, if you don't like the side that we happen to be on, something should be done about you. And they're the people that can flag you for those reasons. Absolutely insane and terrible. And it's just mind-boggling to me that this isn't more widely discussed.
I have to say, a lot of this is quite disheartening, but, we've just witnessed what Genocide Joe is capable of in terms of his pro-Israel policy, but we also already kind of know Trump's pro-Israel policy because he already served, which is going to be worse. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was in charge of the normalization deals with the Arab states, mentioned his plans for his beachfront properties in Gaza. What else do we know about Trump's plans for Gaza and Palestine?
Trump's previous Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, talked about turning Palestine into a hot IPO. They definitely have plans for what to do with the land after they murder everybody, if they get away with it. It's completely insane that this isn't, more of the discussion around Trump's candidacy, especially considering that there have been calls for him to appoint people like Eric Prince as head of the Pentagon, who recently went on record saying that he gave a plan to Israel's government to quickly resolve the Gaza conflict, which was to flood the entirety of the Gaza Strip, essentially killing everyone. That's completely insane. So, I don't know. You're going to hire the Blackwater guy as head of the Pentagon. I don't know. How are people even considering this as like good policy, or like populist or anti-establishment? It's absolutely mind-boggling to me. Again, the issue should not be how to have privatized wars or more efficient wars. It should be no more imperial wars at all. And, unfortunately, it seems like now that Trump is essentially a shoo-in, we're hearing all of this bellicose rhetoric about Iran again. So yeah, maybe Trump may end the Ukraine conflict just like Joe Biden ended the Afghanistan conflict, but Biden helped start Ukraine, and now if Trump ends the Ukraine war when he's president again, they'll probably start a new one in Iran. And JD Vance, his vice presidential pick, seems to be all on board for that. And it's again, I think people need to be very aware of this. And if you're an anti-war American, why are we still voting for the lesser of two evils and thinking that's going to stop these horrible genocidal wars? It clearly hasn't. I mean, they're both warmongers, and they're both deeply tied to Israel, regardless of whether you vote for a Republican or Democrat. Either of the two parties, and even RFK Jr. It doesn't matter if any of these people get in. Palestinians will continue to be slaughtered by AI, and all of those weapons are being planned. The plan is to deploy those eventually at home. They tested them in Ukraine. They're testing them on Palestinians. They're going to test them on all these people on the world that are voiceless, and then they're going to turn them back on Americans. And that's what this entire domestic terror apparatus is doing. And it's not going to be stopped by voting for one of the two parties when both parties are building this nightmare. Like, it just has to stop. And so, I mean, honestly, anyone who has all this renewed, energy, whether it's for Trump or Kamala or whatever, thinking these people are going to be either better for Gaza or better on any of this. No, these parties are garbage. And RFK Jr. on Israel and Gaza is complete garbage. We have no good choices except maybe, Jill Stein on that particular issue. But I mean, we have to organize and do something else and stop thinking that we can just sit back in our armchairs and vote and it's going to stop all of this madness that has just been going on for decades and decades and decades. I know it's it's easy to get wrapped up maybe in sort of the electoral season fervor and all of this and sort of excitement when it's promoted by these, alternative media influencers. But if you are seriously against anti-war and against the out of control national security state, which is the deep state, you can't in good conscience vote for either candidate. And, people say, oh, you can't, who would you choose then in all of this? Both of our choices are bad regardless. It doesn't matter. But I mean, voting for the lesser of two evils when both evils support all of these horrible policies and support these genocidal wars, what are we doing? Obviously, this is not working. We have to do something else.
I mean, it's just so disheartening and disturbing on so many levels, Whitney, that people on the left still say vote Democrat to avoid Trump fascism. But in reality, both parties are worse than the other in so many ways and are both fascist parties.
Who's less of a fascist? They're both fascists. Who cares? And just thinking the only thing we can do to change things is just vote in November is this really the best we have after like more than 20 years of the war on terror still going on, and its guns are about to be turned back domestically for the war on domestic terror that our like bloated national security state like needs to continue to function and take all our money to justify its like huge size that it grew up on the war on domestic terror. It was always the plan to bring the stuff back home. And so we're running out of time. And the idea that like, if you don't vote for my candidate, that must mean you support the other candidate. I mean, no, this is like baby brain stuff at this point. Have you not seen what has happened over the past 4 years, 8 years, any multiple of 4 in our lifetime? Look at what has happened with presidents. There's no point because they're all dominated and controlled. They're all compromised, and they all are selling us out to this fused blob of Silicon Valley and the national security state, which are the same thing. A lot of the big Silicon Valley companies have early ties to the CIA or CIA venture capital like In-Q-Tel. And a lot of these companies, pretty much all of them at this point, are contractors for either military or intelligence. They are the same thing. And they fund both parties, the Silicon Valley oligarchs. It's really an election between Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt in November. And if you ask me, I think they're both terrible, and I think they're both terrible for American freedom, and I want nothing to do with them, and I don't want to vote for either of those guys. And maybe you think one front man or front woman is more affable and friendly and likes the music you like, or says funny things or insults someone you don't like either. But I mean, we have to move past this. The country is in like an awful state. And if this is really the only level of discourse that we can can muster up in 2024, we need to figure out just like what we're doing and take a step back and like seriously think about stuff for a second. Maybe unplug from Twitter for a few days and think about what you're actually doing. And a lot of these alternative media influencers, that were brought up earlier, used to know about the uniparty and talk about the uniparty. And now it's like all of it's gone suddenly. No, it's still there.
Whitney, always a pleasure to have you. We learned so much from you. Your work is so important. Thank you so much for being on today.
Okay, no, thanks for having me. My pleasure.